Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. A group of former top European officials called on the European Union's foreign policy chief, Catherine Ashton, not to ease or delay the implementation of guidelines that would bar the organization from funding Israeli institutions located in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The group consists of senior officials from various European Union countries, including former NATO Secretary General Javier Solana, former French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine, former German State Secretary Wolfgang Itzinger, and Benita Ferraro-Waldner, a former Australian Foreign Minister and European Commissioner. Published in July, the European Union guidelines mandate a denial of European funding to and cooperation with Israeli institutions based or operating in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and a requirement that all future agreements between Israel and the European Union include a clause in which Israel accepts the position that none of the territory in the West Bank and East Jerusalem belongs to Israel. With great concern, we have taken note of recent calls to delay, modify, or even suspend the European Commission guidelines on funding of Israeli entities in the territories occupied by Israel since June 1967, read a letter sent to Catherine Ashton by a lineup of 15 so-called European eminent persons. We urge you to uphold this commitment by supporting the guidelines in their full application by European Union institutions, notably in regard to the ongoing negotiations about Israel's participation in Horizon 2020, the letter stated. Their strict application serves to reiterate that the European Union does not recognize and will not support settlements and other illegal facts on the ground. It is these facts on the ground, not the guidelines, which threatens to make a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict impossible. In a speech at the United Nations in late September, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas endorsed European restrictions on assistance to Israeli organizations located in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, saying in a United Nations address that the European Union approach is a model for other countries to follow as well. Israel fiercely rejects the directive, saying it refuses to sign any further agreements with the European Union that includes such clauses. The authors of the letter warned that a possible deferment of the guidelines, which are set to take place in January 2014, could harm the ongoing peace process. If the European Union were to delay or suspend the guidelines or not fully apply them to the agreement with Israel on Horizon 2020, which is a scientific cooperation program, this could further undermine the Palestinians' trust in the negotiation process and their ability to continue the talks, the letter stated. In other words, delaying or suspending the guidelines is likely to undermine negotiations, not help them. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that there is no compromise, that a PLO state should be based upon 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital in any peace deal with Israel. He said that the Palestinians agreed to postpone Palestinian efforts to join international bodies for 9 months in exchange for the release of 104 Palestinian prisoners detained by Israel before the 1993 Oslo agreements, who killed various Israeli Jews. Abbas said that 26 prisoners will be released by Israel every 3 months. The first of these prisoners have already been released. Regarding the Israeli release of these long-held Palestinian prisoners, Abbas said that it had nothing to do with the current peace negotiations, but rather it was done in return for the Palestinians not making any effort to get full international recognition of a Palestinian state at various United Nations organizations and institutions in the next 9 months, while peace talks are taking place. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as a Jewish state in order for there to be any peace agreement with the Palestinians. How is it that when the Palestinians demand that we recognize their nationhood, that they refuse to recognize ours? Netanyahu said. The Jewish people have been in existence for over 4,000 years. Why do we not deserve recognition? We are working very hard to end the conflict with them. Netanyahu said, I am not fooling myself into believing that this will be easy, but I'm determined to come to an agreement that will not sacrifice Israel's national interests in order to get nice headlines in the newspaper or to receive international applause. In response, Mahmoud Abbas criticized Netanyahu, insisting that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as a Jewish state, saying, Netanyahu's refusal to recognize a Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, his insistence that United Jerusalem is Israel's eternal capital, and his demand that we recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish state indicates he's not interested in continuing with the peace talks. Furthermore, Netanyahu added that any peace agreement with the Palestinians would require that Israel have a security border along the Jordan Valley. Israel rejected a U.S. proposal to put in the Jordan Valley international troops. In the current peace talks, Israel negotiators offered to transfer sovereignty of the Jordan Valley to the Palestinian Authority, which would in turn lease it back to Israel. The Palestinians promptly rejected this proposal. In speaking to the Israeli Knesset, Netanyahu said that Israeli negotiators will have to convince the Palestinians to adjust their demands to the circumstances that surround us. In response to the Israeli proposal, Palestinian National Council member Hanan Ashrari told an Israeli newspaper, no Israeli soldier will be in the Jordan Valley. We will not agree to let Israel control or lease lands to us. We will not take part in redefining the Israeli occupation. She further stated, Netanyahu wants to control the Palestinian state, its borders, and its airspace, and refuses to discuss the option of placing international forces in the Jordan Valley. We cannot agree to this. From our view, it's just the occupation by another name, which wants to rule over us again and control our lives. We won't accept this in any form. So far, all the discussions have focused on Israel's security, she said. Israel is entrenched in its positions and continues to build in the settlements. As a result, negotiations have not amounted to anything so far. In the past month, there have been several terror attacks by Palestinians who killed Jews in the West Bank. As a result, some Israeli politicians are calling for Israel to suspend peace talks with the Palestinians and to suspend the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Israel agreed to release 104 Palestinians from Israeli jails in several stages as part of the agreement to restart direct peace talks. In response, a Palestinian official said, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian leadership hears the opinions in Israel that they are talking about the possibility of freezing the talks with the Palestinians because of the death of several Jews in the West Bank. Therefore, the Palestinians are preparing an alternative plan, which is to appeal to United Nations institutions and organizations with the goal of winning international recognition for a Palestinian state. Frustrated in the progress of the current peace talks, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas plans to travel to Germany, Italy, and Belgium, where he will meet with heads of state for the purpose of pressuring Israel to impose a building freeze in the West Bank and to rethink the possibility of suspending the prisoner releases. Fatah official Jibril Rajoub said that if Israel doesn't reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians, that Israel should be removed from the Middle East. He added, peace is not a Palestinian interest, it's an international interest, and the interest of the world is to put an end to this conflict. I think it's also an Israeli interest. Israelis should decide whether they are part of the Middle East or an alien body. If Israel is an alien body, it should be removed, he said. An Israeli official told an Israeli newspaper that a land transfer proposal is being discussed in the current peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. In the proposal, Israel would transfer land near Shechem to the Palestinians and Israel would annex parts of Jewish settlement blocks in the West Bank. Israel fears that at the end of the 9 months of peace talks, that the United States will publicize a document accusing Israel of failure in the talks. In order to prevent the publication of this document, the report said efforts are being made to discuss the possibility of land swaps between Israel and the Palestinians. During a speech in the United States, Israel Finance Minister Yair Lapid said Israel must come to terms with the fact that it will have to uproot thousands of Jews from their homes to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. We need to have a final map, said Lapid. We cannot escape the need to map the final borders of a future Palestinian state, including an organized plan for the evacuation of tens of thousands of Jewish settlers. At the same time, Lapid said Israel needs to know that acceptable security arrangements will be made to bring an end to ongoing Palestinian terrorism. We need to know how the story will end, because if we know that, we can be more understanding and responsive to the needs of the other party, he said. Therefore, we need to go all out, draw maps, write agreements, and then set a time frame for implementation. In his meeting with U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, Lapid reiterated the Israeli government's commitment to achieving a final peace agreement with the Palestinians. Leader of the Jewish Home political party, Naftali Bennett, threatened that his party would withdraw from Benjamin Netanyahu's government coalition should Israel grant any concession to the Palestinians in peace talks, because they would pose a serious threat to Israel's security and that his party would not allow this to happen. Bennett also stated that his party will not only withdraw from the government, but will lead a political battle at the Knesset to stop any agreement and any concession provided by the government, starting with foiling the poll law that the Knesset intends to vote on in the near future. Meanwhile, Israel Justice Minister Tzipi Livni, who leads peace talks with the Palestinians, said that the Labor political party, which is headed by Shali Yakimovich, should join Netanyahu's government coalition. However, Yakimovich said that she'll only join the government once there's an agreement or she thinks that the peace talks have a credible possibility of reaching a peace agreement. Livni went on to say, regarding the position of labor, it's not enough to give a speech about peace, even if it's a good speech. What's important is to implement peace. As a result, in my opinion, labor should have been part of this government coalition when it was formed, and it's unfortunate that they have so far refused to enter. Meanwhile, at a labor political meeting, Yakimovich said that labor will be a safety net for peace talks if any agreement is made with the Palestinians, but will not be in Netanyahu's government if the peace talks aren't going anywhere. Yakimovich said that she feels that the Israeli government is trying to dissolve talks and is only negotiating for show, and as a result, she will not support this policy. In an upcoming trip to Italy, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans to visit with Pope Francis. Netanyahu will also meet U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry on the same trip. In addition, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas invited Pope Francis to visit the Holy Land in 2014. After the private part of their meeting together, the Pope gave Abbas a pen, telling him, "Surely you have a lot of things you have to sign." Abbas responded, "I hope to sign the peace treaty with Israel with this pen." Pope Francis plans to visit Israel in March. Finally, Israel Knesset member Moshe Feiglin, a longtime Temple Mount prayer rights advocate, sent a letter to the Israeli police asking for clarification regarding the legal authority of the Arabs to control the Temple Mount, challenging the reply of an Israeli government decision taken after the Six-Day War of 1967 that authorized Arab authorities to control the Temple Mount. He then quoted the comments of then Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira from a committee meeting in June 1968 as saying, "We never announced that the entirety of the Temple Mount belongs to the Arabs. We never announced that it's forbidden for Jews to pray there. We never announced that it's forbidden for Jews to establish a synagogue there." Feiglin wrote that in the absence of such a decision, all directives which discriminate between Muslims and non-Muslims regarding entrance to the Temple Mount should be immediately rescinded and free entrance from all gates to the Mount be enabled in accordance with the law. In response to this, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is considering an appeal to the United Nations Security Council over what he termed serious Israeli violations in East Jerusalem, specifically on the Temple Mount. Israel has no right to split up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, neither physically nor in terms of prayer times, Abbas said, and stressed that all East Jerusalem is Palestinian. Meanwhile, Hamas political bureau chief Khaled Mashal called for Arabs and Muslims to come up with a strategy for what he called the Judaization of Jerusalem until we do it again, Shalom, in Yeshua the Messiah Amen.